But I'm trying to say that 2008, we saw all these big changes happen. We saw acquisitions, we saw mergers, we saw banks going bust, we saw acquisitions, mergers, splits, and new brands appearing and old brands disappearing at the same time. So, let's talk about the UK retail banking landscape around 2008. Let's take it back a little bit. Let's talk about what the UK retail banking landscape looked in like 2006, 2007. And by that, I mean, I'm going to talk about the major banks that were in the market. So we have the big names. We have people like RBS. We have Barclays. We have Santander. They're a little player at this point, but they're there, so we'll put them on the board. We have Lloyds Banking Group, which I'm not going to write out. I'm just going to put LBG. You're just going to have to bear with me that that's Lloyds Banking Group. And we have HBOS. Nobody ever officially said that HBOS stood for Halifax Bank of Scotland, but if it didn't stand for Halifax Bank of Scotland, I'm really confused why they went with that name. Anyway, so these are some of the really big players we had in the market. And then we all know what happened in 2008. Things went a bit wrong. Oh, and before I get into that, there's one really important bank I should add on this list, because this will not make an awful lot of sense if I don't do that. So let's remember Northern Rock. I know it's hard to remember them at this point, but it will make sense when I get there, I promise you. So these are the big banks we've got. We've also got some little players. So we've got a company called Alliance and Leicester. And this is where I spell Leicester wrong. Please bear with me, lovely people of Leicester. At least I'm not pronouncing it the American way. We've got some other players. There's a little one over here called Bradford and Bingley. One of my favourite names from a bank. And there's quite a few other little players in the market. But the point being, back in 2008, this is kind of what you're looking at. Well, 2006, 2007, this is what you're looking at. This is the UK banking market. And when you wandered down the high street, you saw all of these banks. You saw branches from all of them, which is going to be really important when we come into some later sections. Because what I want to do is I want to start by giving you the landscape in 2006, 2007. We'll talk through what happened in 2008. Then we'll talk about all the drives of change that have happened between now and then. And we'll talk about what we're starting to see now emerge, because it certainly doesn't look like this in the UK anymore. So some of 2008 happens. There's a big crash. And as everybody knows, a lot of the banks weren't prepared for that. And whilst I previously explained how, banks do make money, they weren't making enough money to survive what was going on at that point. So what happened? Well, for a start, we lost Northern Rock. They just couldn't survive. They had a run on their bank, one of the first ones we'd seen in a very, very long time in the UK, but there was no way of pulling them out. Barclays just sort of sat there. They did all right, actually. So, we can just leave them alone for the moment. RBS, we all know what happened there. They had to be bailed out. And there were conditions of them being bailed out. And that included selling a load of their branches. So whilst back in, 2006, 2007, you would have seen RBS on the high street, you would have seen some NatWest, and you probably also would have seen a brand called Williams & Glyn. One of the conditions of them getting money from the government to stop that bank going under was that they had to get rid of Williams & Glyn. Now, we'll come back to that in a bit. But the initial idea was that they were just going to sell that. They were just going to sell it to somebody else so they could handle those branches. And it would mean that RBS had basically less things to focus on, but it would also mean that there were more banks in the market. And as we'll come on to later, more banks was perceived as better by the regulators. But we're not quite there yet. That wasn't quite the inspiration for that decision. And then we've got what happened over here. Well, poor old Alliance and Leicester and Bradford and Bingley, you won't see them anymore. Well, you will see bits of Bradford and Bingley, but not in any way near the numbers you did before. And that's because they were sold. So Alliance and Leicester became part of Santander. Bradford and Bingley, even sorrier story, it was nationalised and then it was broken in two. It was cut into pieces. And part of it went to Santander and part of it remains a separate entity today. But again, you're not seeing that anywhere near as much as you would have done on the high street. And then we've got our Lloyds Banking Group and our HBOS. Halifax Bank of Scotland, Lloyds Banking Group is Lloyds and now TSB, but HBOS had to be bailed out. And then that wasn't really enough. So it was bought by Lloyds Banking Group. The interesting point here is that some of these brands you'll still find on the street, so you will still see Halifax, and you will still see Bank of Scotland, and you will still see TSB, which also was split out from Lloyds, but that was at a slightly later date. So the whole point of this diagram is it's a very simplified version, but I'm trying to say that 2008, we saw all these big changes happen. We saw acquisitions, we saw mergers, we saw banks going bust, we saw acquisitions, mergers, splits, and new brands appearing and old brands disappearing at the same time. So this was really the catalyst for what I'm going to talk about next, and this was really the catalyst for change. So 2008 caused this. The effects of it, some of these decisions were impacted by regulators. Some of them were impacted by the market. The banks just couldn't be sustained anymore, so their assets were sold off and bought. We had nationalisation of banks. As I said, we had runs on banks. All of these things we hadn't seen for a very, very long time in this country. And so this really is the starting point for the huge changes that we've seen over the last sort of 10, 12 years in this country. And also it kicked off a further programme of changes and events, particularly in the regulatory space, which is what I'm going to talk about next.